Welcome to the Managing Water in the 21st Century workshop. I see we have quite a cross-section here today, ministry staff and representatives from the Forest, Land and Natural Resource Operations, RDOS staff, of course, municipal operations, Penticton, Summerland, elected officials, can't forget those. Reps from the Okanagan Basin Water Board. I believe we have a representative from the RCMP here as well. And of course, various irrigation districts. So today's workshop was made possible through a partnership with Okanagan Basin Water Board and RBC Blue Water Project grant. I'd like to give special thanks to Zoe Kirk, a water ambassador for the RDOS, who put a lot of effort in organizing today's event. So thank you very much, Zoe. Today's workshop gives us an opportunity to better understand geoclimatic shifts, open up dialogue between agencies, share knowledge, and utilize local expertise so we can all take a fresh look at how we manage water. With this, I would like to extend a very warm welcome to the Executive Director of the OBWB, Dr. Anna Warwick-Sears, who will introduce our first speaker.
It's been incredibly valuable for the Water Board and for all the people who are working with us on Okanagan water science and water research and trying to figure out the best way to manage the water as a valley as a whole, to have this group of really high caliber scientists and professionals working out of the Summerland Park Research Station. It's really an incredible asset to the community, and because of having this research station so close in the RDOS, it's allowed us to really be ahead of most of the entire country in terms of the kind of research that we have access to. So Scott is also a alternate on the Okanagan Water Stewardship Council, which is the advisory body to the Water Board. He has been participating for many, many years in the climate research and the work that we've done to understand the valley-wide water supply and demand dynamics. And he's really a great resource. I'd like you all to welcome Scott Smith.
Thank you very much to the directors of the RDOS for the opportunity to speak, to Anna for those kind words and the plug for the Pacific Agri-Food Research Station, and in particular, of course, to Zoe for her efforts in bringing today's event together. So I'm going to speak for about 45 minutes. And I'm going to give you a whole lot of facts and figures and a little bit of trivia about the hydrology in the Okanagan Basin. And the idea being that this kind of lays the foundation for you when Bob Sanford speaks after me on some of the bigger implications of our climate system and how it's changing. So I'll speak in essentially three sections here. The first one, Zoe asked me to describe a little bit about what's under our feet. And I am a soil scientist, so that part of the presentation I'm fairly comfortable with. The second part really talks about the hydrologic cycle, and I'm not a hydrologist, and I'm a little bit less comfortable with this section. And I'm going to be reporting the work of others in that section. And then sort of link it together with the whole climate change implications, some of the natural hazards and processes, and how these are linked to that hydrologic cycle. As I said, most of the work that I will present is the work of others. And as Anna mentioned, the Okanagan Water Supply and Demand Project, which has been a major focus for the Stewardship Council over the last 6, 7, 8 years, it contains a wealth of information. I'm going to draw extensively from that work. And then my own team, led by Denise Nielsen at the Pacific Agri-Food Research Center. Denise has collaborated closely with climatologists to develop high-resolution gridded climate data sets for our use here. We've really been ahead of the game in terms of some of this information that's allowed the the fairly intensive modeling that's gone on, and I'll report on some of that. And then a number of other sources of information that I will be pulling upon here in this presentation. So the first one, the biophysical environment, just how the landscape here was formed and some of the material types that we see, and get into the historical climate record here. So our landscape was produced as a result of Pleistocene glaciation. The entire basin was overridden by ice. This picture actually doesn't do it justice in that the Okanagan would have been completely overridden by ice. There were no peaks sticking out through the ice. And that is what the very rounded form to most of the bedrock outcrops that we see here is a function of, this overriding of glacier ice. This most recent glaciation, about 20 to 12,000 years ago, was one of many that occurred during the geologic Pleistocene, a period of time of the last 2 million years or so. So in fact, the valley's been glaciated many times, and the very deep profile of the lake is certainly in part a function of these multiple glaciations. It's also a large geologic fault that the lake follows for the most part. And this weaker material would have been scoured out by these multiple glaciations. Most of the soils that we have here in the area of my study are result from this glacial event. And glaciers are really messy things and deposit of a wide variety of materials. But in a nutshell, as ice moved over the basin, it deposited beneath it glacial till, which mantles most of the upland. And so the soil conditions on the upland, the plateau surface, are fairly simple and fairly uniform, mixture of all of the regional rock types. And this till material tends to be a fine matrix of silt, sand, and clay with numerous boulders and gravels in it. But in the valley floor, at the time of deglaciation, when there was a tremendous amount of meltwater pouring off these ice sheets, and we're talking about cubic miles of water moving through this system down towards the Columbia outlet, a variety of sorting goes on so that we end up with materials that vary from clays right through to gravels. I'd like to talk about a couple of material types that are important for us here. The first being the glacial lake deposits. And probably most of us are familiar with the silt bluffs we have around town. All of that material is a result of deposition into a glacial lake. So during deglaciation, we had a stagnant chunk of this Cordilleran ice sheet sitting out in the middle of the valley. And on both sides of it, with ice further afield, melting and bringing meltwater in here, we had linear lakes that existed between the valley wall and this stagnant ice. And into those water bodies was deposited primarily silt, fine sand, and some clay. And today we see these as the bluffs, the so-called silt bluffs that are common around town. This is, again, not as mountainous as the Okanagan, but these bodies of water may often be trapped between ice and the valley wall, or may in fact occupy entire valleys. This map from the Geology of the South Okanagan, a publication by Murray Roed and Bob Fulton, the blue areas highlighted here that essentially show you the extent in locally here of these glacial lake deposits. On the Naramata Bench, of course, on the West Bench, and along the valley wall between here and Summerland. These, I guess the primary characteristic of these materials is that they are highly erodible. And so I know, in fact, up on the West Bench, there's been a geotechnical study done about the interaction between water and these highly erodible materials. So that's one of the key materials here that can be a problem can be unstable, can be subject to piping, water eroding through them as well as over them. Next big family of materials, the glacial fluvial deposits. This is the material that's laid down directly by meltwater, glacial meltwater, and in this valley, we see this material on the flanks above the glacial lake sediments. And this is, of course, what the gravels look like today. They tend to be high and dry and well away from current water bodies, but a very valuable resource for the community in terms of construction. And we do, in fact, have a number of gravel pit operations occurring up on the west bench above the glacial silts. The main deposits of glacial fluvial materials, a couple of interesting examples of glacial fluvial materials in the local region here. One is just south of Okanagan Falls along the Oliver Ranch Road. The area is shown here in gray with these letter K in here. This is an example of glacial fluvial deposits that when deposited, buried chunks of ice. And those chunks of ice have melted over time and left depressions called kettle holes in the material. Fantastic example of kettled glacial fluvial deposits exist along the Oliver Ranch Road. Amazingly, much of that landscape's currently being used for vineyard production, and they do manage to work on these rather steep slopes around these very concave circular depressions. So next time you're up there, you see these big depressions along that Oliver Ranch Road. Those are kettles. Those are glacial fluvial kettles. The other family of glacial fluvial deposits that are kind of renowned here in the Okanagan Valley, down around Osoyoos Lake. So between Osoyoos Lake and right up to Oliver, on the east side of the valley are the Black Sage Road, sometimes referred to as the Black Sage Sands. In this case, the flow regime was such that a sheet of sand was laid down without ice, without a lot of gravel. And we have these sandy deposits that, again, currently support the majority of the vineyard. Majority of the vineyards in the Okanagan Valley are located on these sandy deposits. And without water, without irrigation, of course, these soils would be unproductive soils. But with irrigation, they do allow growers to be very precise in how they manage water in these materials. So they have become probably the soil of choice for much of our premium wine production. Alluvial fans. Anytime you're in a mountainous environment, we get these high energy fans, and the arrows are showing you the fans, these deposits at the base of steep slopes where creeks emanate out from the mountainous topography out into the valley floor. And these were formed quite actively immediately in the post-glacial, but are still active today. We have a number of examples, and I'm going to show you in particular the Golden Mile. As we probably know, the story of Testalinden Creek. Testalinden Creek blew out on onto its fan down there, but there's a whole series of fans along that side of the valley down there, and these are geomorphically active landforms. The last major material is something called Klu Viam, and this is really the debris that exists on steep slopes and moves under the influence of gravity. So when we have landslides and this kind of thing, this is usually the material that's involved, and it's usually the interaction between this material and water that triggers movement, sometimes referred to as mass movement, because there's a mass of material that moves episodically. And how much movement? There's both episodic movement and there's ongoing continual movement. I just show you this slide, and you notice the big white stripe through the middle of this material. That's volcanic ash from Mount Mazama. It's about 6,700 years old. So that much material has come down on top of the land surface. If this was the land surface 6,700 years ago, you can see how much material has slumped down off this slope onto that in that time period. So anyone who's involved with building highways, I think, in this part of the world is quite familiar with Klu Viam and the challenges that it presents. And last, of course, the alluvial floodplains, and floodplains not to be confused with these glacial fluvial deposits, which are ancient deposits from a flow regime that existed during deglaciation. The alluvial floodplains are the active floodplains of today's rivers. And these two photos are from the Similkameen Valley. And I chose the Similkameen Valley because the river is by and large in its natural course with its oxbows and its meanders. Of course, on the Okanagan River, there's only one small portion of that river that is in its native state. Most of it has been channelized, so we don't see these landforms in their original state. But obviously, floods occur on floodplains, and people love to live beside rivers. And I think that there's an increasing awareness of the risks involved with a changing hydrology of developing on floodplains. So those are the major materials that we have, and that kind of lays the sort of physical framework. And now I'd like to talk about the historical climate that we've got here.